everybody. We are so excited to launch this sport panel discussion today. This kind of situates itself under plenty of positivity. We always focus on life lessons, sport, and career. But recently, there was an educational series launched, and I do have to extend the credit out to Dr. Calvin Lawrence for suggesting a sport panel discussion. And so here we are. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really just amplify the voices of the experts in the area in this particular podcast episode on sport management. And we also have an expert in sport psychology. So we'll have an intersection between both subject matter there. So I would love to first start out with introductions. We have Dr. Megan Buning, Dr. Luke Mashburn, and Dr. Michael Ross. So I'm going to extend the floor out to Dr. Megan Buning to introduce herself and provide a background for our audience.
Well, thank you, Dr. Beck. I appreciate it. So I am let me start with currently. I am currently a clinical associate professor at Florida State in our Center for Athletic Coaching. We have an online master's degree and graduate certificate. So that's what I do full time. Part-time, I do the CMPC work, Certified Mental Performance Consultant, and that is providing mental skills training. So that's that sports psych that you're talking about. I get to work with a bunch of different types of clients that range from athletes, coaches, and also corporate types of organizations. I'm a former Division I softball pitcher from the University of South Carolina, and then I coached collegiately here at Florida State, Coastal Carolina, and Ole Miss before getting out of coaching and getting into faculty life. I was a previous associate professor, research professor at Augusta University. And then I also have been broadcasting with the SEC Digital and a little bit here and there with ESPN since 2015.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Buning. And we will pass it over to Dr. Luke Mashburn.
Well, I was going to go in the same order as Dr. Buning, but I have to begin with Go Gamecocks. I'm a proud alumnus of the University of South Carolina, and it's my undergraduate alma mater. Love everything about USC, and I'm a proud first-generation college student. I currently am an assistant professor of sport management at Georgia Highlands College. I was previously the department chair of kinesiology and wellness. I also teach at NYU. A lot of my teaching is very practical based. I teach sport business practicum, a lot of operations courses because my background also came in Division I athletics, but not as an athlete. Despite this incredible physique, not a Division I athlete, but I worked for 4 Division I athletic departments in event and facility management. Kennesaw State University, the University of Kentucky, Sam Houston State, and Northwestern State in Louisiana. I also worked for Atlanta United, an MLS club for 4 seasons, where I was on the senior staff. And I've done a little contractor and consulting work with Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, and a few other leagues.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Mashburn. And we will pass it over to Dr. Michael Ross.
Absolutely. Washed up college basketball player, I guess, is probably the way to start that. Loved it. Loved my time as an athlete. It was fun. It bleeds over into a lot of how I teach and how I deal with my athletes now, get the opportunity to connect with them. So played 4 years of college basketball, graduated, went to the University of Georgia where I mastered in kinesiology there, and then Troy University for my Ph.D. I'm currently the department chair, full professor, and faculty athletics rep at Shorter University. So I like to stay busy. I don't sit still easily. But before that, I was an assistant athletic director at the interscholastic level. Enjoyed my time there. It was fun to get the logistics, the experience. I started a youth training company when I was 24. I still do that in the summers. Like I said, washed up basketball player, but I still like to help people get better. So skill development, functional movement training is kind of the name of the game with it. And then I worked for the Atlanta Hawks organization for about 5 years, doing a lot of stuff in the summers on the side. You know, I jokingly tell my students now, housed within our College of Business, I chased a basketball as long as it would let me, and it led me to where I'm at now. So excited to be here, and it's going to be good.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Ross. Like I said, this is the first time we are doing this. If you are not familiar, my name is Dr. Courtney Beck. adjunct professor at Florida State University, founder of Plenty of Positivity, and former D1 athlete, specifically in the realm of gymnastics. So I want to jump right into this. As far as like an introduction question, we'll start off with one that will be able to expand into each perspective from our three experts. So what are the most significant changes you have seen within your particular field, say between 5-10 years, and how have they impacted particularly athletes and organizations? So I'll pass it off to Megan.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I think the biggest change that I have been a part of with the sports psychology field and crossing over into coaching is people are now more likely to employ or use professionals like the CMPC or that have that credential to help with mental skills training. Something that we see in the field that's been an issue is just kind of anybody will say that they are a mental coach, and you don't know what kind of training and education that those people are bringing, and you're talking about dealing with the mental aspect of performance, so it can be a little touchy. So I'm really glad that in the last several years we've seen a transition to try to put more rigor in the field.
Fantastic. And Dr. Mashburn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, I think the biggest change that I've seen in the past decade is probably money, in a word. And I think it really goes back to the last answer that we've seen athletic departments expand in a lot of ways at the college level and add mental health professionals and other areas, which is fantastic. We've also seen money start going to student athletes in the form of NIL and revenue sharing now, and in those things, which have obviously significantly changed the industry. On the pro side, I don't think that you can pick up your phone without getting a notification that the Dodgers have signed somebody for an insane contract. And then obviously in my area of events and facilities, stadium prices are just through the roof right now. I believe $15.6 billion worth of facilities open in this calendar year in 2026, which is obviously a massive number. When you think back, again, to a decade ago, a Truist Park opening at $700 million is almost obsolete in today's market with $2 billion facilities opening.
Thank you so much for that, Luke. And Michael?
I think for me, I like to kind of look at the lower level of things. I think there's become such a reliance on technology and kind of this virtual space. So I think a important emphasis is starting to be replaced on soft skills, on getting in front of people, of being able to kind of have those touch points and interact. I think we have a generation of student athletes at this point that have gone through COVID. They're on the tail end of that, but they were in their adolescence when that was going on. And I think a lot of the socialization that we naturally learned that maybe some of us older take for granted at times, is something that we still have to consider with them. So I think a lot of the socialization that we're looking at and just being able to have those organic conversations and things that we strive for within the workplace that creates a team environment and makes a group successful. It's something that we in education are starting, I wouldn't say relearning, but we're also putting a big emphasis on making that a part of curriculum and making that a relevant conversation that continues.
Can I piggyback on that? Sorry, since this is a conversation. On the COVID part of it, within the field of sports psychology and in education, I think COVID really exposed a lot of things. And there were some terrible things that came from COVID, but there were also some things that are now getting addressed. And one of those is the importance of mental health and addressing that with athletes and coaches. And it is also, from a teaching perspective, the value and skill set that is required for online learning. So I think there's been a lot of good, we'll say, that has come on the back end of that COVID. So it's interesting to hear the crossover in the sport management side too.
Absolutely. I think that's a time where we all learned a lot, both good and bad.
Without a doubt. And the next section, if you will, literally is the intersection of like sport management and the psychology arena. But I'll start with sport management first. So we'll start with you, Luke. How are organizational decisions evolving to better account for athlete mental health, and where do you see this actually going into the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we have seen big strides as far as staffing goes and those kind of things, which is great. I think we can probably all agree it's not quite enough, but any progress, particularly in our industry, is good progress. And so That's something that's great in my area and in my personal experience. So when I worked for Atlanta United, we had the first European style training ground in the United States for soccer. It was a 60 million, 33-acre complex. And we used a sports psychologist to help us design the building. And really from an athlete well-being standpoint, from a rehab standpoint. Traditionally in soccer, you're going to have maybe a 100-year-old club in England that has maybe an 80-year-old building and isn't as conducive to modern sport operations. And we had our technical director played for a club called Fulham in England, and they had an old building. And when he was injured, he would go in a separate locker room called the injured players locker room because the English are fantastic at naming things. And he would train very separately from the club, and he wouldn't even see his teammates. And so when we designed our building, we were very intentional about that. Obviously, we started in the locker room, and the locker room was circular. Of course, the circle has a lot of symbolism as far as unity and unbrokenness goes. It also doesn't have any corners. So if you have a bad day out on the pitch, there's not a corner to sulk in, and your teammates have to lift you up and be there to support each other. We also built our rehab space overlooking our training pitches, our first team fields, with a garage door with a piece of turf in front of it. So you have the building, you had a strip of turf, and then you had our two natural grass fields, and there was a garage door there. And the reason for that was so when our players got injured, we could open up that garage door, we could slide the bikes out on the turf, and the guys could rehab while their teammates trained. They could hear the coach yelling, they could smell the fresh cut grass. They were still a part of our club, and they weren't isolated. So not only were they nourishing their bodies and getting back to full strength, they were also still a part of the team and not dealing with that isolation and loneliness that a lot of athletes deal with when they're going through injuries. So for us, on my side, I've been some facilities. We're seeing more and more buildings being purpose-built for both the mind and the body, which is a fantastic thing.
Fantastic. Thank you for emphasizing that point, because I do think that's extremely important. I mean, looking back on just experience, I know we all had experiences, but yeah, when you were injured, you were kind of like, yeah, you were under the same roof, but at the same time, you were in your one spot. So just to think about how, like you said, when buildings are being actually built, it's the focus on the mind and the body. So thank you for sharing that, Luke. And Michael, the same question.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I have a response quite as in-depth as Luke on that one, because I think that is a fantastic example. And honestly, I wish more people would hear about the intentional design and just the focus behind that, because I think what that's a result of is storytelling in a lot of ways. And I think it's giving athletes a voice and letting them express, hey, when I went through this hardship, this injury, something like this is what negatively affected me. And when we can see that, then we can proactively start to make changes, whether it be a multi-million-dollar facility or a conversation or an integration within practice and things of that nature. You know, my last couple of years of playing basketball, I played on an injured foot. I blew out my bottom of my foot, that type of stuff. And it is one of those things. Any athlete will tell you, when you can't do the things that you love to do, there's already this kind of weird perception of like, I don't fit in anymore. Right. And we kind of have that mental approach to it. So, you know, if you're fortunate enough to have a team or have an organization that takes a proactive approach and says, hey, we see you, we're here for you, we want to see you get back, you're not forgotten, you're not an afterthought. What an important concept that is. To me, going back to the original point, though, I think being able to give athletes a platform to express their frustrations openly and it not be kind of distasteful or ignored or anything in that nature, I think it's needed. So, you know, when we look at maybe public relations or we look at media relations and things of that nature, I think packaging authentic stories so that athletes can express their frustrations in a way that's looked at as meaningful is something that we have to continue to foster. And I think you've seen that, especially, you know, like we talked about since COVID. I think we've been able to almost take a step back from the speed of how life was leading into that. And you're able to see athletes battle this because the vast majority of the population went through some feeling of it, some degree of difference. So I think it allowed a lot of athletes. I always go back. I'm a big basketball fan, obviously, but I think about like Kevin Love when he started coming out with things. I think about Michael Phelps. I think about Simone Biles. I think about all of these just larger than life athletes who they packaged their story in such a meaningful way that it caught people's attention and it provided an ongoing discussion ultimately to where we're at now. But yeah, I think the importance of storytelling in combination with this is something that needs to continue.
Absolutely fantastic. And Megan, as far as just more of that sports psychology, the question that we'll kind of discuss here is, what emerging psychological trends do you believe will become more prominent within the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Well, because I want to comment on this, I would love to see more of what Luke discussed. That's evidence-based practice. We know in our field that isolating injured athletes is one of the worst things you can do for them. And sports psych people, professionals, whether they're CMPC or licensed clinical mental health professionals, we've known that for years. And to hear that organizations, events, and facilities, anybody in that field is saying, you know what, we're going to identify professionals to help us build these facilities to help, but we're going to identify the professionals that actually know something, so I love to hear that. And I hope that is more of a trend in the psychological space, is that collaboration. And I agree with you, Michael, that needs to be told more. I had no idea that happened. And that is a wonderful story and an example of how the fields can cross over and work together for the best of the athletes or for the betterment of them. In terms of other trends, I think we're going to see, and I think, Michael, you mentioned this too, the technology piece of it. We're going to see more technology coming into play with the psychological elements. We're already seeing that in terms of, HRV and tracking that, the biofeedback in various forms. We're seeing neuro type feedback, eye tracking. So I think that is going to come forward with some of this other technology tracking for stats and skill movements and those sorts of things that we're seeing with the sports as well. And lastly, I'll say that I'm hoping this trend keeps going. There's a lot being done for athletes. There's never going to be enough professionals to help all the athletes, but athletes have been the primary focus for a long, long time for clinical mental health and for sports psychology type services. And I would like to see that transfer over into coaches and more into game officials. So we're getting a more inclusive approach. Parents as well.
I love that. I love that you mentioned coaches, because it's so interesting, just the discussion on that, because you're right. It's very inclusive on athlete perspective sometimes, but I feel like coaches, when you think about even just, I think about NIL and transfer portals and the team dynamic. And yes, some of these coaches are getting paid a lot of money, but at the same time, I mean, they're human beings as well, and their mental health matters too. And I think to be able to provide them like certain services as well, I really like that point, Megan, that you make of expanding the focus, not just within the athletes, but then expanding it outward into parents, like you said, and coaches. I love that.
And honestly, support staff as well. As someone who worked 150 events a year, a lot of nights, a lot of weekends, and in my first couple jobs made 18 grand and 27 grand, we see a ton of burnout in our young professionals in this industry who not just have tough jobs, but have problems finding other jobs, right? Any of us who have hired, whether it's for a coaching position or for an administrative position, you're going to get hundreds of applicants or more, maybe into 4 digits. And so the issues that we all face that maybe we don't want to talk about, because much like the athletes, we don't want to sound weak. We don't want to sound like we're complaining, is something that I do hope comes to the forefront as well in the next decade or so, that it's okay to be burned out working every single college event for 5 years. That's something.
Well, yeah, and piggybacking on that, Luke, I think that's important to understand. I think, athletics and sport has offered a platform that transcends a lot of other opportunities, right? So I think it's interesting to see, again, just these prominent athletes coming out and being vulnerable and putting it out there, because if we see the best of the best in the world expressing this vulnerability and being upfront about shortcomings or things of that nature, I think it kind of gives this gentle nod to everyone else that, hey, we can start talking about this. Like my role model, this person that makes, millions of dollars, that's larger than life, that we ideally think can do no wrong or experience no hardship. Oh, they're real too. Well, then I guess that my stuff is justifiable when I bring that to light. So I think it's it's unique when we see it come from people of prominence. And I think we need more of that.
I think you have to address too the stoicism movement of sorts that was, that's from decades ago, from our grandparents that came up. And it was this need to be, especially with men, we've got to be stoic. We can't show any emotions or any fear or anything. Nothing can get to us. And I think back then, when you're talking about the types of wars and what was going on, it made a little bit more sense, I guess. But when you think about what we know psychologically from now, the decades and decades of research, we know that doesn't work. And so, but for some reason, that is still transcended generations. And so we're trying to combat that. And it's going to take prominent people like what you're talking about, Michael, coming forward and being more vocal. But think about the courage that Michael Phelps had to have to voice that. It might have been a little bit easier for Simone Biles, just being a female, because we kind of have that stigma, right? But for Michael to speak up, for Kobe Bryant, when he spoke up and talked about that. So we need that.
But the consequences of not speaking up are dire. And sadly, we see that as well. That this past weekend, Tiger Woods, right? And obviously my doctorate is in something else, and I don't make clinical diagnoses on people in an area I'm not qualified in, but I think we can all tell the man has a problem. And, I think that I saw a lot of that sentiment this past week of, I hope he gets help, which I even think that is progress, that we have moved away from the TMZ world, the VH1, where are they now, of celebrating these people's downfall. And I saw a lot of, I hope he gets help, because it seems like there's something wrong there.
And I think adding into that as well, and I think the thing that's going to only make this more valid as we go forward, it has to be authentic. And I think that's kind of the downfall in this is we do have that other side of the coin where people think it may or may not be popular to express these concerns, these things, these hardships that are not validated and they're not there. So when we hear it from someone that's authentically going through it, maybe we don't hold it to the same regard. And I think that is going to continue to be a battle that we have to consistently address, because when it does come from someone who is authentic about it and they are seriously going through these hardships and they come forward with it, Megan, to your credit there, the courage behind that is absolutely incredible.
What I'm hearing and what I also experience when I work with clients and students in the field is I see a huge gap with this emotional intelligence and self-awareness, because people that are emotionally intelligent and that have this sense of self-awareness are going to be able to do what we're saying more often and with that courage and non-judgment. And that comes down to people like us in the faculty roles, in the consulting roles, in the podcasting roles, to help people understand what is going on, and then giving them tools and strategies to how to develop emotional intelligence and self-awareness.
Such a good point. And as you all were speaking, I was just thinking about the transition of coaching as far as coaching styles over, say, like the last 25 years. Back in early 2000s, the mentality was very much one-way communication, very authoritarian, versus kind of what you all are saying, like as far as being able to voice, as far as from the athlete's perspective to the coach. So of course the two-way communication, but then also demonstrating emotion, because that was something that you just keep going. That's what was instilled, I feel like, in all of us, especially, of course, at higher levels of different, obviously, sports we're speaking about. So I do believe that there's definitely been progress over, like I said, arguably the last 25 years, just from early 2000s leading up to here, 2026. But I would love to kind of transition into more youth development, like the future pipeline, if you will. So my question for all of you, we'll begin with Megan, but what innovations are needed in youth sports systems to better prepare athletes for the demands of elite sport, both mentally and organizationally?
That's a big question, because you have to keep in mind, not every youth is going to go to those levels, right? So when I think about the youth level and preparation, I see this as, and Luke, you alluded to this some with how the mental skills translate into other areas of life, and they absolutely do. I work with people that are not athletes all of the time. And so being more intentional in that youth space from the psychology part of it, the mental training part of it, catching them when they're younger, teaching them basic mindfulness, teaching them reflective practices, teaching them how to become more self-aware and take ownership. And while you do that, you also teach them the resilience piece. That I think that is key, a key skill to help them as they move through. The physical skills and all that is either going to come or it's not. And that's something that goes into practice, practice, practice. I think what's missing from that age group is the psychological preparation.
Very good point. And Luke?
Yeah, I think in a different question, I think Megan hit on it earlier when she mentioned coaches, parents, and referees, which this may not be the best psychological phrase, but sometimes everybody just needs to chill out a little bit. And we just need to rein it in because not everyone is going to go pro. I was watching the Women's Elite Eight last night and Dawn Staley's Gamecocks beating TCU. And right there on the ad boards, 98% of NCAA athletes will go pro in something other than sports, which obviously was a massive ad campaign for the NCAA for some 20 years. Understanding that and understanding that, yes, a lot of parents, particularly in our country, put a lot of pressure on those athletes to do that. Obviously, working in professional soccer and seeing those issues are really tough because not only do the parents put a lot of stress on the kids, I'll go back to my answer from the first question. We're putting a lot of financial stress on the parents to pay to play soccer. Youth volleyball right now is insane as far as club volleyball and those costs and travel and all of those things go, which is really, really difficult for a family in general. And obviously that can lead to other issues as far as stress, anxiety, mental health, all of those things 100%. And so I think that is really important. And then I think, another big thing is, again, understanding how mind and body work together, and that we have seen so many athletes when they get out of it maybe fall apart. And I think we have made it clear that I'm the only non-collegiate athlete on the call. So thank you guys for very much pointing that out. But I was a high school athlete. I was captain of the track team. And, when you get away from that and you get into another environment, for me, going from high school to college, obviously there are changes and things going on. But if I had maybe stayed in shape and stayed quite at the level that I was obviously competing at, but if I had still maybe ran in college and did things to help my mental health and to do the things that we know are really important, how breath is connected to mental health and those kind of things. If I had known that 19 years ago when I started college, maybe things would have been a little easier for me in that transition. And so I think that's important as well, is having that exit strategy. And we talk about it some now with youth sports and especially maybe in soccer going pro at 14 or 16 and how MLS clubs will set them up to get a college degree after that and those kind of things, which is fantastic, which is very important and we need to do that. But how are we going to continue to help them on their journey as maybe they've lost their identity, which I think is something that Mike said earlier as well, that when that's taken away from you, that maybe you were the soccer player your entire life or the basketball player your whole life. And when you're not that anymore, what are we doing? And obviously, I think those two things go hand in hand, that mental health support as well as degrees, job skills, those kind of things to put them on that next path.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Luke. And Michael?
So I hope y'all can clear your schedule for the next hour. No, this is honestly, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I started a youth training company years ago. I think we have to kind of cater our expectations. And I think it's something where we have to be realistic. And I'll talk about this from a couple different levels. Y'all bear with me. I'm a storyteller at heart, so I'm going to go with one here. But I remember when I first started my company, typically what I do is I bring athletes in. We do an individual session. I'll put them through kind of a generic session to test skill sets and athletic motion and just see where they're at functionality wise. We typically go about an hour, and then I carve out about 30 minutes after, and I'll sit with the parents and I'll sit with the players and say, hey, this is what I saw. This would be my game plan moving forward. This is our plan of attack. If you guys are good with it, let's set up a routine. Let's go from here. And I was working with a young man, again, years and years ago, and we go through his session. He does a great job. I'm sitting there and his dad asked me, he said, "Hey, what do you think?" And I said, "Sir," I said, "I love your son. He works really, really well. He listens. He's trying hard." I said, "I think there's some athletic prowess in the making there. I'm excited about it." He said, yeah. But what do you think?" And I said, I think he's respectful. He works hard. I think we can see a lot of progress. This would be my expectation, timeline, that type of stuff. And he said, "Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the compliment. But what do you think?" I said, "Sir, what are you asking me?" And he said, "Does he have a chance?" And I said, "A chance for what?" He said, "A chance to get a college scholarship." And kind of the funny part of this is I said, "Sir, your son's in 4th grade." And it was one of those things where it really sat into me. We have turned sport into a business so much, and it's result driven. We're no longer process driven when it comes to development. And I think if we're tying that back into the psychological well-being of these young men and women, we have to be able to keep in mind and consider that this is an overall development of an individual by using athletics. Athletics is not the outcome that we're looking at. If they get a chance to play in college and get a scholarship, or even today earn a living through NIL and things of that nature, what a blessing. But that is the exception, not the rule. And I think if we shift that mindset to how do I help these young men and women develop so that when they face adversity within their life off a ball field or a court or something of that nature, they have the athletic mindset and drive to overcome this adversity like few others do, while it not being lost because they didn't get a college scholarship, right? I think we just have to get back into this realization that sport has its place and it has a unique ability that far few things ever will. But we have to keep in mind how we can proactively use that and implement that for the betterment of these young men and women. And fast forwarding to Luke's point, I think about when I got done playing college ball. It was one of the things where that was my life. It was a family thing. I come from a line of athletes and coaches, and every time we get together for a family reunion, "Hey, Mike, how's ball going? Right? How's your training going? You just finished school ball. How's travel ball?" It was always the topic, and it was so fun, and there's so many great memories to that. But at some point, the ball stops. The last day that I'm putting the shoes on and the jersey and competing competitively, it inevitably is going to end. And that's something that I love talking to my student athletes about now. I always ask them, and I start telling them this, especially their junior year, because at that point, if you're going to get a chance to play at the next level or not. You have a good working understanding of your odds there. And I always ask them and encourage them, I'm like, "Guys, how are you competing whenever your sport ends?" Right? Because you have trained the majority of your lifetime with having a goal, having a work ethic, going to study hall. Like, there's always been a means to an end, and there's always been some kind of structure that you have to follow. So how do you compete? It's something that Dr. Mashburn and I have discussed on multiple occasions. It's something I love to joke with my athletes now, because every now and then I get them coming in saying, "Hey, you want to go have a shooting contest?" And I'm like, "Absolutely, right? Let's go do this thing." But I always tell them, my way of competing now looks very much like helping them find a job that they're passionate about. My way of competing now is designing a program and an experience and a curriculum that benefits them and it prepares them. And if you would have asked me that when I was 21 years old, I would have laughed, because I had no idea what that looked like, right? It wasn't basketball. It wasn't the team coming in that's our rival. It wasn't anything of that nature. But I think it's important to find outlets, and even just, again, reiterating what Luke said, those skills we learned along the way, right? Being healthy, eating well, sleeping habits, things of that nature that add an evident quality of life to us. Those are things that we don't need to completely turn off once our sport ends. We just need to see how we can continue to compete with those healthy habits that we've developed over the course of our lifetime and through competition. So to me, I think we have to have a standard and expectation as we're going through those developmental years, especially on the adolescent side of things. But I think there needs to be a heavier emphasis as we get into adulthood on what practices will continue to serve us well, despite looking different when the end result comes.
True. As you all are speaking, I just think about how real athletic identity was for myself coming out of college. I mean, of course, we know that you're going to have to get a job after, but for the time's sake, during those 4 years, it's very difficult to join other, if it's academic clubs, anything to further that progression, if you will, once you get out to find a job and to find a job in a career that you will enjoy. But that was something definitely that I struggled with. And I think I think if we move in this direction of all of these experiences that we're sharing when we were in college athletics, high school athletics, but to be able to translate those into what you were talking about, Michael, into curriculum that could help athletes now, is that setting them up for success through a curriculum that focuses now on skill sets, or even during an interview, like, discipline, responsibility, but how those lessons learned in sport, how you actually speak about them in an interview to land that position. That, yes, the 3 to 4 years of experience may not be there, but as far as the discipline, as far as the creativity, thinking outside of the box, maybe you did something with NIL, you're on social media marketing or something, but it's a changing landscape that I think we need to adapt to help these athletes, especially since we've lived a lot of this too. I think it's an excellent point all of you all make. Speaking of innovation, but leadership, culture, and innovation will be our next section. So we'll start with Luke on this one for sport management. But how is leadership evolving in sport organizations, and what innovative approaches are emerging to build healthier team cultures?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different things. And, Courtney, you mentioned kind of in the last sort of bumper between questions about, changing in coaching styles over the years. And as you were talking about that, I thought a lot of that maybe has to do with social issues. And we have moved away from just men coaching in women's sports. And we had our first ever NCAA Division I volleyball national championship team that was coached by a woman just this past year. And so we're obviously seeing progress in those strides. And I think we see a lot of that in the front office as well, that we are seeing more diversity and more diversity of thought, that we are seeing different people from maybe different fields come in. Obviously, for a long time, we know that it was the football coach became the athletic director, and that's kind of how things went. And of course, we have now seen that become an actual business and those things that take place. And because of that, maybe we've seen people come from outside of sport. And obviously, I have some conflicting feelings on that, but I think at the end of the day, I do feel really good about that, because any kind of diversity, and if it is diversity of thought and bringing people in from other industries and other backgrounds, is really huge for us. So I think that that's big. And I think that that goes hand in hand with some of the things we've talked about with the pandemic, that the world is smaller than ever. That I remember 10 years ago, I think I was still doing first round interviews on Skype, which I don't know that I've said Skype in the past 6 or 8 years, right? And obviously with Zoom, with our networking tools that we have, the world is very small. And so I think we're seeing more globalization in leadership as well. And we're seeing more international thought processes taking place, which again, I love, because any kind of different and evolving thought process for me is really important. Of course, I think we still have great strides as far as some of those social issues go, as far as traditional diversity goes, and getting more women and people of color into meaningful roles. But I do think that we are making progress there. And again, as we said earlier, progress can be a little slow on those fronts. But I do think we are making strides on all fronts of having a number of different kinds of diversity, from traditional diversity to diversity of thoughts and backgrounds as well, which for me is probably the biggest thing in leadership, because you get different kinds of coaching styles and things. To your point, obviously, if you're coming from another industry, you may be more of a transformational leader and not so much a transactional leader. How many buckets can you score for me tonight, and those kind of things, which obviously we've seen come heavily into our field, and a lot of that from maybe psychology and turning into true sports psychology as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Luke. And Michael?
Luke, you'll get a laugh out of that. I had a student about 2 weeks ago ask me if I was old enough to have had a MySpace at one point. So we got a good laugh over that. I told him my theme songs were on point with that. No, I think getting back into this, it's interesting. I mean, getting into the coaching styles, obviously that's something that lands near and dear to my heart. I have a faculty member that has done a ton of research on servant leadership. And I think that's something that's going to continue to become more prominent, especially with NIL, because we have this weird cross section right now of athletes who I believe want to be coached hard. I don't think we're looking at the Bobby Knight era. I don't think we're looking at that extreme of coaching anymore. But I don't think we're at the other end of the spectrum where athletes don't want to be coached. I think they want to be coached hard. I think they want to be trained hard. I think that's a sign of love and commitment to them. But I think the modern athlete now also wants to know that you have their best interest in mind, and it's not just transactional, right? So it's this weird servant leadership dynamic, a little bit of dichotomy built into that. So to me, I think we're seeing that transition not just on the coaching surfaces as well. I think we're seeing that in leadership roles. I think because a lot of those student athletes, they're getting out of their playing days, but they still expect those expectations. They're competitive. They want to reach a standard. They want you to tell them how to improve so they can reach these metrics and goals that they've set in place. And I think that's important. Taking it to another level, you're talking about innovation. I keep harping on this, but I'm such a fan of just the power of sport and the platform that it provides. And I think when we look at global scale perspective, such as the Olympics, the emphasis we're seeing put on like green initiatives or fiscal responsibility and things of that nature, I think that shows the importance of sport, because now we're saying, yes, sport is what's drawing you in. It's the connective piece that we all come together to really enjoy with. But we're also able to talk about and address things that transcend just the playing surfaces, the competition, everything else. I look at the upcoming Olympics and just kind of the precedent that that's setting, knowing the historical strides with it and why they were selected, because they show fiscal responsibility, they show innovation, they show these things where when we look at the Olympics, it's kind of got this stigma right now that a lot of people don't want to host it because of that financial pitfall that has kind of come from so many games. But just looking at that global model, I think that's something that we can see a lot of our student athletes and young professionals really embody as well. Because, hey, I can take this platform, I can highlight it, I can catch people's attention, I can bring them in to engage and just kind of consume this product while also understanding that we have more that we can accomplish.
Very good point. And Megan, I have a question. It was kind of off of Michael's perspective, but I thought it was an excellent point that you present, Michael. But from a sports psychology point of view, but with the dynamic right now with coach versus athlete and how that dynamic has changed, like we said, just the way that they communicate now, there's more of that two-way communication. But then also when you filter in maybe social media and the fear that if a coach says something, it may amplify on a social media site, like where do you see us moving that? Even yes, if we are moving in the direction of two-way communication and that student athletes want to be coached, but how do we find that happy medium for coaches to be those coaches that they want without the fear of something amplifying and kind of going out of control when it doesn't need to be, but just to focus on the effectiveness from the coach to the athlete to produce the results?
Yeah, that's a really tough area and space to be in. And I can speak to this from a coaching perspective versus the psychological component, because what I see with this is coaches have to, well, first you said something that stuck out to me. It was coach versus athlete. So, I think that is an old school, not that you think this, but this just that term, that was the mentality. It seemed like coach versus athlete, like athletes versus the umpires or the referees, that kind of thing. And so adapting this mindset that it's not one or the other, it's all. Both things can be true. I can be a coach and I can be effective, and you can be an athlete and responsive, and we can work together. But to get to your point, I think this is where coaches really have to identify what their team expectations are, what are the boundaries for them personally, professionally, and as a team, set some boundaries with the social media use. And if there's clear communication and articulation up front from both the athletes and the coaches, and this is a transparent conversation, then it can work where the coach doesn't feel like they're going to be held under some microscope if they say something. Now, what I will also tell you is that a lot of coaches and game officials in particular don't use social media for that reason. because they don't want, and that's a preference that they have made. And that really just kind of knocks a lot of worry out of the park. However, to me, when you say, how can coaches coach with the social media piece without fear? My then thought is, what are they doing that they're afraid to get exposed? So if there's that element to it, then I'm now questioning what's going on with the coaching practices in terms of like how they're leading and how they're presenting and setting up practices and talking to athletes, that kind of thing. I think one good example is I don't think it might have been last year. I can't remember. One of you two might can help me, but Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, and he had a football player that did he quit? I know he was filing a lawsuit.
Yeah, so he maybe sort of quit, maybe was sort of told to kick rocks, depending on which version of the story it was. He had recorded a lot of what had happened. He had some kind of injury and didn't show up, and there was maybe a miscommunication in the staff of, did he no call, no show, or did he not show up? And then Lane used a lot of language around employment and said, you didn't come to your job, you're fired, those kind of things, which sort of prompted the lawsuit, because obviously, to this day, student athletes are not employees. But yeah, it was possibly a miscommunication with the staff, but it appeared that he quit to Lane. And then, and there was some very harsh cuss word language used on that recording as well.
Yeah, so it's that kind of situation that, to me, what is the behavior that you're trying to not expose? Because as a coach, if I am upfront, if I am transparent, if I have best practices, I am treating people with respect, then I'm not scared of me and an interaction with an athlete getting exposed. It's kind of like you don't have closed door meetings, right? You always have somebody in the room with you, or doors open, that kind of thing. So I'm a little harder on coaches. So I'm just going to say, to answer your question, if you don't want to live in fear of something getting posted, then why don't you make sure you're doing things by the book, within your standards, expectations, and you're transparent about it, and treat people with respect. Nothing to worry about then.
No, absolutely. And I think, I guess what I'm referring to is not that they're maybe behind closed doors doing something wrong, but as we know in sport, it can get very emotional, especially during a game. And you've seen coaches, even on the sidelines, it's just naturally the emotion takes over. I'm not saying it's right, but in those moments where something goes viral and then they have to explain it after I don't know. It's just stuff like that I feel with social media. It really does. It amplifies something that may, look bad even on a video, but maybe even between the athlete after a while, once it settles. It's like, okay, I understand where you were coming from. Yes, you probably could have worded it differently or whatnot, but just that fear, like I said, of walking on eggshells of is that going to be posted? So yeah, I respect what you're saying though, as far as behind closed doors coaching. Absolutely.
Well, I hear you on that also. And then again, this comes down to teaching coaches and athletes emotion regulation. How do we regulate those emotions? How do we manage? We can be mad at it, but how we present that and experience that, especially with others present, needs to be appropriate and professional. And sometimes we have to have those conversations. And that's I actually work with that a lot with all of my clients, is what is appropriate. I have an athlete that I'll meet with in the next couple of days. A couple of weeks ago, he got angry and threw his helmet. Okay, you can get mad at the situation, but we're not going to throw the helmet. So we need to come up with something different to help you move through that emotion a little bit more professionally. So what you're talking about is less likely to happen, Yeah, and the other thing is, if these coaches are going to express themselves that way, again, transparency, the athletes knowing upfront, this is what is going to happen, this is what it means, that absolutely can help. Even if the athlete doesn't like it so much in the moment, at least they were told upfront, my coach may lose their cool here, and this is what it's going to look like.
And to Megan's point that I loved of holding the coaches to a higher standard. These are grown men and women. And if an 18 to 22-year-old throws a helmet on the sideline, okay. If a grown man whose team hit a buzzer beater puts his forehead up against the forehead of a referee, which I have seen on social media 100 times in the past week because Dan Hurley did that when UConn hit the shot. I'm not saying people need to be exposed on social media, but I'm also not saying it's probably not deserved. There probably needs to be a conversation about why is a grown man acting that way? Because that was odd to me. And I don't really have another word other than odd and strange behavior of why would you do that? And again, for me, that is the difference that, a kid makes a mistake. Okay. A grown man does something like that. Okay. Maybe as a society, we do need to talk about it. And right now our platform to do that is social media. Obviously 100 years ago it was the town square. And so it's a different situation, but I do think that maybe we do need to have those conversations because that was, it was just weird. I've never seen anything quite like it, to be honest.
Yeah. And the coaches are modeling behavior, because then you see your youth athlete next week do that. Why did you do that? Well, because I saw coach in the Final Four do it, So I agree, Luke. I think that, coaches, they may get upset when that behavior is exposed, but at the same time, again, then don't do it. If you're going to be upset and ashamed, then let's either give you some tools to help you better manage or don't do it.
Absolutely.
I like that emotional regulation as far as a focus for coaches. Like I said, I feel like in those moments you just watch, just basketball right now. It's incredible. And it's, as we know, like there's so many emotions, the wins, the downs, everything. And I think being able to regulate our emotions, I think, is very important. And the expectations, I like how you mentioned that too, Megan, was setting expectations up front with the team, expectations of social media, expectations of behavior from coach, athlete, so forth. I think that's excellent. And I thought we would round it out today with future and innovation. So obviously, like emphasis on innovation, projections, like kind of that foresight. But this will be for everyone as far as the question. But we'll start with, how about we start with Luke? So what is one major disruption or innovation you believe will fundamentally change sport in the next decade?
We love buzzwords, and I think we've kind of hit around some of those even in this conversation of technology and globalization. And for me and what I do, the buzzword is fan experience. And especially coming out of COVID and all of those things is how do we rebuild that fan experience and those kind of things. And so for me, those intersect at a really interesting technology that we see right now with a business called Cosm and a few other businesses. They're trying to replicate that. So Cosm is essentially a massive movie theater or a mini version of the Sphere in Las Vegas, where you can go and watch games. And there's one in Dallas, there's one in LA, there's one opening here in Atlanta. And they focus on international events. And for somebody who follows English football and may not be able to go watch my club play in London often, I can go to Cosm and almost experience it. And more than that, have that fan experience. And I've seen clips of the ones in Dallas and in LA. They did a big game 7 watch party for the Dodgers, and you saw people hugging each other. And the only place I've ever seen strangers hug each other other than that was in a stadium. I've never really seen that anywhere else. We normally don't hug strangers and people we don't know, but that's acceptable at sporting events. And kind of replicating that fan experience, some of that group membership theory. And I think a lot of that goes back to what we lost, that we didn't have that for a year or two, depending on what sport we followed, that we didn't get to have those experiences and be around people, and that we want to be back around that. And I think that what they're doing from a tech standpoint, from a globalization standpoint of being able to watch different worldwide events and kind of cater to different people, but I'm not just sitting on the couch and watching it. I'm experiencing it with other people is massive. And then obviously that fan experience piece. So for me, any technology that brings those three things together, globalization, technology, and fan experience, for me will be very disruptive in the next decade. And I think there are lots of examples of that, but Cosm is one that we kind of see on the forefront of that.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Luke. And we will shift to Michael.
I think for me, I don't know if disruptive is the right word there, but I think it's just kind of a continuation. Data analytics, biometrics, when we look at kind of the training perspective of things, I think people are getting so nuanced and so specific on how the body functions, right? And that's even transcending into just health protocols and things of that nature. I think we're getting so much more specific, and getting into Megan's, I would love to see an emphasis put on those kind of focuses, but toward mental health, to be able to see how athletes react in certain situations, or crunch time, or, like we're talking about a heavy situation at the game. Oh, well, this person scored on these metrics and it shows that they're ready for a position. I don't know that we're to that point, but I think it would be interesting to look at, again, getting more into the training specifics of it. I absolutely love and nerd out on technology that shows me minute details about how my athletes shoot a jump shot, and when their body starts to break down, and the rotation on the basketball as it leaves their hand, and just everything else. To me, that is so fascinating because, growing up in a small country town, you basically do it off feel, right? You have to figure out what works for your body and what doesn't. So if I can set up a video camera that records me and gives me all of these data points, and it's in real time, and I can see, hey, after 30 minutes of shooting, the lift on my jump shot decreases by 4 inches. I need to start using more upper body strength. That's invaluable. It's incredible. And the fact that that information is becoming readily available for youth sports, not just the professional athletes, to me, I think you're going to see a heavy emphasis on data analytics. I'm curious to see if we lose a touch of the personal connection due to a reliance on data. So I guess that would be the disruptive piece for me.
Very good point, Michael. And Megan?
I'll tell you mine from the psychology, but I want to talk real quick about what Michael just said. I am already seeing coaches lose the ability to read situations because they're relying heavily so much on the analytics. And it breaks my heart. That's all I'll say about that. But from the psychology part of it, I don't know if this is coming down the pipe, but something I could see a little more of, and something that I am actually emphasizing with some of the teams, is the disc behavior profiling, or using some sort of profiling for positions within certain coaching staffs. So they have these ideas of what, we'll say basketball, what a point guard, the behaviors that they want that point guard to have. And then they do that for every position. And then you have recruits come in and you have them take that assessment and see how much they align to those profiles. And that gives you a better idea of the behaviors that you're working with. Because I have seen recently a basketball team, and they are running an offense that is not conducive to any of their players on the court, and they struggle because it's so out of those players' comfort zones. So I don't know, maybe that.
Megan, to that point, I use the disc in my freshman sport business practicum class, and I will get kids who come in and say, I want to be in sport marketing. And then they're a big S and they don't like talking to people. Okay, now we need to have a conversation. Maybe you should look at the things that Mike just talked about, and look at analytics, and look at the way you think and those kind of things.
Yeah, or learn how to adapt, right?
Absolutely. And that is one of the first assignments we do. It's about the second week of class, and the papers I get in that just take my breath away of, I knew this about myself, but I never realized it, and seeing it on paper. And now I have to think about my career, because in week 1, they do a purpose statement where they write what they want to do. I wanted, work in marketing for an NBA team. And then we compare that statement to their disc results. And is it realistic? Does it align with their personality, or does it not? And so obviously I hope that we see that not just in the areas you're talking about, but we see it in the front office as well.
I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I believe the meshing, if you will, of like different personalities, especially with the team dynamics changing so incredibly frequently in some sports, of course, with transfer portals, athletes coming and going, maybe even coaching staff for that matter, a lot of turnover in coaching, but to be able to have that cohesiveness, to bring that cohesiveness back, and obviously to utilize resources such as the disc profile, I think is going to be absolutely fantastic. So thank you for bringing that up, Megan. I just want to thank all of you. So Dr. Megan Buning, Dr. Luke Mashburn, and Dr. Michael Ross for coming on to the first sport panel discussion to talk just like where we're headed, future innovation, kind of those future projections. So I want to thank you all, and I look forward to the next one. So if you guys have any closing remarks, I'll just open it up. So Megan, we'll start.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where the future goes to, and I hope people that listen reach out if you have comments, questions, or if you want some additional thoughts on this stuff. And thank you, Dr. Beck, for having me.
Absolutely. And then we'll transfer over to Luke.
Yeah, no, just to echo those statements that, I think I'm also excited to see where things are going. And I think the prevailing theme here was we're all very much looking forward to the future in a positive way. So plenty of positivity, right, Dr. Beck? So I think that that's something that obviously we didn't talk about going into this conversation, but I think that we all kind of carried throughout because the future of the industry does look bright. And there are a lot of really cool things on the horizon.
Thank you so much for that, Luke. Just like highlighting positivity, especially within sports. So I'll go ahead and transfer it over to Michael.
Absolutely, Dr. Beck. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come on here and speak with my colleagues, myself, everything. This has been so fun. I will say this. I think these conversations need to continue. And I hope something that we talked about today resonates with somebody. Would love to see a comment dropped, future conversations that we can all get back on a call and continue the discussion. Man, I think sport's powerful, right? And I think when we start looking at sport being integrated into the well-being of people long-term, long after sport ends for them, I think it's something that warrants in-depth and constant conversation. So I hope we get a chance to do this again soon.
Absolutely. And once again, I just want to thank you all, and we'll go ahead and close it out here.